She thought he was just the quiet old man at the end of the table, the one who fixed things, stayed in the background, and never asked for recognition. Then, in a moment of frustration, his granddaughter told him, "You're not part of my real family." He only nodded, but later, he opened a wooden box he had kept closed for 50 years. Inside lay medals, letters, and photos that revealed a truth no one in the family had ever seen. What she discovered would shatter her assumptions, mend a wound she didn't know she'd made, and redefined what it means to be family. The dining room was filled with the kind of noise that only comes from family gathered in one place clinking silverware. Overlapping conversations, laughter bubbling in waves, and then fading into the low hum of voices. The smell of roast chicken and cornbread lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of iced tea, sweating on the table. It was Saturday evening, the kind of night when Maggie liked to gather everyone under one roof. Her way of keeping the old traditions alive, even as the kids got older and more distracted by their own lives. Frank sat at the far end of the table, not in the seat of honor, not at the head, just where he always did, close enough to listen, far enough to let the others shine. He was comfortable there. His granddaughter Lily sat across from him, her hair pulled back in a quick ponytail, fingers tapping impatiently on her phone hidden in her lap. 14 had come with sharp edges, with moods that shifted like weather fronts. She was smart, restless, too quick sometimes for her own good. Tonight she had already sighed at 2 questions about school, rolled her eyes when her mother reminded her about chores, and stirred her mashed potatoes without eating them. Frank noticed. Of course he noticed everything, but he didn't say anything. He never pushed. It happened suddenly, the way words sometimes escape before thought catches up. Maggie had said something light-hearted about Lily having her grandfather's quiet eyes, and Lily had snapped. Her fork clattered onto the plate as she looked up, cheeks flushed. "He's not my real grandfather," she blurted. "He's not part of my real family." The sentence hung in the air like smoke after a firecracker, sharp and startling. The room went silent. Even the sound of the old clock in the hall seemed to pause between ticks. Maggie's face froze in shock. One of Lily's cousins let out a soft gasp. Eleanor, Frank's wife, reached instinctively for her water glass, as though a sip could wash away the sting. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't argue or scold. His eyes, steady and dark with years, simply settled on Lily. They were heavy, not with anger, but with something deeper, something that came from carrying too much history to be undone by one sentence. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he was acknowledging not just the words, but the ache beneath them. Then he set down his napkin, folded with careful precision, and rested his hands on the table, as though anchoring himself in the moment. No one knew what to say. Maggie started. "Lily," that was, but her voice caught. Eleanor's hand hovered near Frank's arm, a gesture of comfort she didn't quite finish. Lily, realizing too late what she'd done, dropped her gaze back to her lap, shoulders stiff. The silence pressed down on the room, heavy, suffocating. Frank broke it, not with words, but with movement. He stood slowly, his chair scraping lightly against the hardwood floor. His face was calm, almost too calm, as though he'd prepared for this moment, long before it arrived. "Excuse me," he murmured, voice low but steady. That was all. No defense, no correction. Just a simple departure. He walked out of the dining room, his steps measured, carrying the weight of a man who knew when silence was stronger than speech. Behind him, the family remained frozen. Maggie reached out as if to call him back, but her hand fell uselessly to her side. Eleanor pressed her lips together, eyes wet but unspilled. In the hallway, away from the table, Frank exhaled. It wasn't a sigh of anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something older, quieter. The breath of someone who had learned long ago that love doesn't always get recognized in the moment. He rested his hand against the wall for a beat, steadying himself in his chest. The words Lily had spoken echoed not as cruelty, but as a reminder of what had always been unspoken. The truth that blood ties and chosen ties don't always look the same to the young. Back in the dining room, conversation resumed in awkward fragments. Maggie tried to move the evening forward. Eleanor asked someone to pass the bread, but the warmth had drained out of the air. Lily sat stiff in her chair, fighting the sting behind her eyes, not yet ready to admit regret. Frank climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. In his study at the end of the hall, he closed the door behind him and sat heavily in the old leather chair that had shaped itself to his body over decades. His hands, rough from years of carpentry, rested on the arms of the chair. On the shelf, Nearby sat an old wooden box, untouched for years. He glanced at it, then turned his gaze back to the window, where the night pressed gently against the glass. The words replayed again, not part of my real family. He didn't argue with them. He didn't fight. He simply nodded, carrying the wound the way he carried all the others. Quietly, without spectacle, but deeply. And in that moment, alone with the silence, he knew the time was coming when Lily would need to see not just the man at the end of the dinner table, but the story behind him. Frank sat in the quiet of his study, the faint hum of the furnace filling the stillness that followed him upstairs. He had left the table without asking for understanding, without correcting Lily's words. There was no point. A child's sentence could cut sharper than any blade, but Frank knew that answering it with heat would only harden it in her memory. Better, he thought, to leave it alone. Let silence do its work. The study was a small room tucked at the back of the house, filled with the smell of old pine and leather. Books lined the shelves, manuals on carpentry, a handful of war memoirs he had never finished, family albums stacked like bricks. The desk was scarred with decades of work, half-faded notes written in pencil, rings from coffee cups, a corner worn smooth where he'd rested his arm too many times to count. And on the middle shelf, the one he never touched, sat the wooden box. Asterisk. The box had been with him since 1972. Oak, with dovetail joints, a brass clasp dulled with time. Inside was a life he rarely allowed himself to revisit, faded letters from Eleanor during the long nights overseas, medals he never wore, photographs of men he hadn't spoken about in decades. He had carried it from house to house, closet to closet, always promising himself he would leave it shut. For years, it was easier to build a life in the present than dwell on what lay inside. But tonight, the weight of it seemed heavier than usual, as if it was waiting for him. Frank lowered himself into the chair and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His hands hovered above the box but didn't touch it. Instead, he pressed his palms together, fingers laced, and bowed his head. The words from dinner replayed. "You're not part of my real family." They were just words, the sort of careless thing a teenager might say when impatience boiled over. Still, they stirred something deeper, something he had carried quietly for years. He thought of Maggie, 6 years old, and clinging to his hand, the first time she called him Dad. No one had forced her. It had slipped out naturally one evening, while they were building a birdhouse in the garage. Frank had felt his chest tighten with a warmth he couldn't name. From that moment on, he never thought of her as anything less than his daughter. And later, when Lily was born, he had felt the same surge, holding her tiny body in his arms, whispering promises he never said aloud to anyone else, that he would protect her, guide her, and never let her feel unloved. Yet now, at 14, she questioned whether he belonged. Frank didn't fault her for it. The world was sharper now. Kids were restless. Identity mattered in ways it hadn't before. Still, the sting lingered. He reached for the box again, fingers brushing against the brass clasp. For a long moment he sat frozen, torn between leaving it closed forever or opening it to let the past speak. Downstairs, the clatter of plates and muffled voices drifted faintly through the floorboards. Life went on at the table, as it always did. But Frank knew something had shifted. The silence he carried upstairs had not erased Lily's words. It had preserved them, waiting for the right moment to respond. And maybe, just maybe, that response wasn't an argument or a lecture. Maybe it was this box dot. He drew in a slow breath and unclasped the lid. The hinges groaned softly, like an old man stretching after too long. Inside lay the relics of a life Lily had never seen. He touched a photograph on top, a black and white image of himself, impossibly young, helmet tilted, eyes sunken with exhaustion. Behind him, the jungle blurred into shadows. He remembered the day vividly. He remembered the sound of helicopters, the shouts, the smell of earth after rain. He set the photo down carefully, then pulled out a folded letter, the ink smudged from sweat and years. Eleanor's handwriting, rounded and steady. "Come home safe. Maggie needs you. I need you." He closed his eyes. That letter had sat in his breast pocket every day of his last tour. He had survived, though he never told anyone how much he doubted he would. Frank leaned back in the chair, holding the letter in one hand and the photograph in the other. His heart was steady, but his thoughts spun. Lily thought he wasn't real. Family. Perhaps it was time to show her not who he was by blood, but who he had always been by choice and by sacrifice. For now, he folded the letter, placed it gently back into the box, and shut the lid. His hands lingered on the wood. Tomorrow, maybe, he would begin tonight. He let the silence settle around him, like an old friend. Upstairs, alone, Frank Mallory prepared not for an argument, but for a revelation. Frank Mallory had lived most of his life in the background, the kind of man who didn't turn heads when he entered a room. He never needed to. He wasn't flashy, not one for bold speeches or sweeping gestures. If anything, people often overlooked him until something broke, and they realized he was already there with his toolbox, kneeling quietly, fixing it before anyone asked. In his town, you could measure a man by how many people called him by name at the grocery store. And by that count Frank was known, but not in a way that demanded attention. He was the steady presence at the 4th of July parade, holding the flag with quiet reverence. He was the man who built the nativity set for the church lawn every December, repainting chipped shepherds and hammering loose nails without waiting for thanks. He was the neighbor who shoveled not just his own walkway in winter but the widow's next door, the one who stacked firewood on porches before the cold settled in. He lived in the seams of the town's daily rhythm, not celebrated, but relied upon. Frank's life was made up of simple routines: early mornings with black coffee, no sugar, long walks around the block with the old beagle that had been Eleanor's idea of retirement company. He still rose at dawn, as if the bugle of reveille might sound from some unseen barracks. After breakfast, he liked to putter around the garage, tinkering with bits of wood, building shelves no one asked for, birdhouses he would quietly leave on porches. He never advertised himself as a carpenter, though that was his trade. Instead, he considered it part of his duty. If he could fix something, he did. It wasn't until much later that people realized how much of the town carried his fingerprints. The benches outside the courthouse, Frank had repaired those. The community center's warped doorframe, he straightened it one summer afternoon with only a level, a saw, and a steady patience. Even the school playground had his handiwork in the form of sanded swings and tightened bolts. He wasn't the man who cut ribbons at ceremonies, but the man who kept the ribbons from fraying before they were ever tied. Eleanor often teased him about how invisible he made himself. "You're like wallpaper, Frank. People don't see you, but they'd sure notice if you were gone." He'd chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck, not sure if it was a compliment or a complaint. Truthfully, he liked it that way. The spotlight had never suited him. It reminded him too much of things he'd rather not revisit: moments when his decisions had meant life or death, moments when too many eyes had been on him, waiting, silence, anonymity, the background that was peace. Still, there were cracks. In the image, Maggie, his stepdaughter, had always seen him differently. She used to say he had a way of walking into a room that made her feel safer, like the air itself steadied. She told Lily once, when she was younger, that Frank was the strongest man she knew, not because he carried weight in his arms, but because he carried it in his soul without setting it down on anyone else. But children forget those kinds of stories as they grow older. They see what's obvious: the man at the table, who doesn't share their last name, who isn't in the faded baby photos, who seems quieter than the uncles who tell loud jokes. To them, he fades into the background. That night, sitting alone in his study, after Lily's words, Frank felt the truth of it. He had spent so many years being the man no one noticed first, and now his granddaughter, the girl he had held as a newborn, saw him as barely part of her world at all. It wasn't her fault, he reminded himself. She was young, too young to understand that family isn't about who stands out in the photos. It's about who's standing beside you when the room empties. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint sounds of Eleanor clearing the table downstairs. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, rough and lined with decades of work. These were not the hands of a man who sat idly in the background. They were the hands that had built a life for a family, even if some chose not to see it. He thought of Lily again, her ponytail, her restless fingers on the phone, her quick words. She hadn't meant to wound, not really. She was frustrated, trying to claim her own identity. But she had cut deeper than she knew. Frank looked again at the wooden box, still closed now. Inside lay proof of the man he once was, the man he rarely revealed. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to step out of the wallpaper. Not for himself, he had lived long enough, without recognition. But for her, for Lily to see that even the man you don't notice first may be the one you remember longest. The truth was, Frank never planned on becoming a father. Not in the traditional sense, anyway. When he was younger, he thought his life would be about work, carpentry, steady hands on wood and nails, the quiet satisfaction of something built to last. Children had been a distant idea, something other men talked about while passing around cigars. But life rarely follows the lines we draw for it. And his life bent the day he met Eleanor. Eleanor was a widow then. Strong and steady, but carrying a grief that never left her shoulders. Her husband had died young, leaving her to raise 6 Maggie on her own. Frank had met her at a church social, both of them at the food table, both of them reaching for the same plate of cornbread. He remembered the smile she gave him. It wasn't flirtatious, or even particularly bright. Just warm. The kind of smile that said she'd been tired too long, but hadn't forgotten how to be kind. They married quietly. A small ceremony with family, in the pews, and a simple reception in the church basement. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate dances, just laughter and homemade pies. But the moment Frank remembered most clearly wasn't the vows or the cake, it was Maggie's hand slipping into his when no one was looking. She didn't say a word. She just held on, small fingers wrapping around his, and in that moment, something shifted. He wasn't just a husband. He was being asked, silently, to be more. At first, Frank wasn't sure how to fill that role. Maggie was shy, cautious, and slow to trust. She'd lost one father already, and children who lose too soon tend to guard what they have left. He didn't push. He showed up. Every school play, every softball game, every late-night math problem that left her in tears. Frank was there, quiet and steady. He learned how she liked her eggs in the morning, over medium with toast cut diagonally. He learned the names of her dolls, the songs she hummed when she was nervous, the way she chewed her pencil erasers to stubs while doing homework. The first time she called him Dad, it was an accident. They were in the garage building a birdhouse. She had just finished sanding the edges when she looked up and said, "Dad, is this smooth enough?" The word tumbled out so naturally that she didn't even realize she'd said it. But Frank froze, the hammer slipping from his hand and clattering onto the workbench. Maggie looked startled, like she wanted to take it back. He smiled, not too wide, just enough to let her know it was okay. "Yeah, kiddo," he said softly. "That's perfect." From then on, the title stuck. Not forced, not corrected, just grown, like something planted in soil and left to root. When Maggie grew older, her friends never questioned it. They knew Frank as her dad. He was the one who showed up to parent-teacher conferences, who sat in the bleachers at basketball games, who threatened the boy who brought her home late from a date. He never reminded her that she wasn't his by blood. She never reminded him either. What mattered was the choice made quietly, over and over again, to love each other like there had never been a gap to begin with. Years later, when Maggie married and had Lily, Frank felt the same surge of belonging he'd felt the day of the birdhouse. Holding Lily in his arms for the first time, he didn't think about biology or last names. He thought about promise. He whispered it into her tiny ear as she squirmed and fussed. "I've got you. Always." That promise never wavered. Not through the colic nights, not through the tantrums at age 3, not through the scraped knees and the birthday parties and the long afternoons when he rocked her to sleep in the old recliner. He had built a family, not by blood, but by choice, by consistency, by presence. And yet, 14 years later, that truth had been reduced in a single sentence here. "Not part of my real family." Sitting in his study, Frank let the memory wash over him. The birdhouse, the garage, the small hand in his teeth reminded himself that one careless sentence could not erase decades of love. Families aren't measured by DNA. They are measured by who shows up, who stays, who refuses to let go when life frays at the edges. He had been there every step, and he would keep being there, even if Lily didn't yet understand the story she was part of. If you drove down Main Street in Millbrook, Virginia, you might have thought you'd stumbled into an old postcard someone forgot to update. The courthouse stood at the center like a stubborn anchor, its white columns a little chipped but still proud. A barber pole spun lazily outside Jenkins' barbershop, and the diner 2 doors down still had the same linoleum floor it had opened with in 1963. On Saturdays, the sidewalks filled with families holding paper bags from the farmer's market, kids chasing each other around the oak trees that lined the street like guardians. American flags hung on every third porch, not as decoration but as a habit. The town hadn't changed much in decades, and that was exactly the way people liked it. Frank Mallory fit into this place the way a stone fits into a riverbed, not flashy, but steady, weathered into shape by years of quiet current. He wasn't the kind of man people stopped to photograph, but if you asked around, nearly everyone could tell you a story about him. Mrs. Carver at the bakery would say he came by once a month to fix the squeaky hinge on her screen door, refusing payment, but accepting a loaf of rye The high school principal remembered how Frank had volunteered to build new bookshelves for the library when the budget couldn't stretch that far. Even the mailman could point out the porch swing Frank repaired after it snapped beneath the weight of 3 laughing teenagers. It was a town where reputation traveled faster than the newspaper. And Frank's reputation was simple, reliable. If he said he'd do something, it was done. If he needed help, he showed up. He didn't have a business card, didn't advertise. Word of mouth carried his name more effectively than any flyer could. To some, he was just that carpenter guy. To others, he was Maggie's dad. To most, he was just Frank. He had a way of disappearing into the background even when he was right in front of you. At town hall meetings, he sat near the back, hands folded, listening more than speaking. At Sunday service, he was the usher who held the door, the one who nodded quietly when people thanked him. Children didn't run to him first, not the way they did with louder, more animated grandfathers, but they always seemed calmer sitting beside him. Dogs liked him instantly. Widows trusted him with their leaky roofs. People noticed him when something was broken because odds were Frank had already fixed it. Yet for all that, he never considered himself important. He often thought of himself like the wood beams he worked with, hidden inside the walls, unseen, but holding everything up. He liked it that way. The spotlight belonged to others. Maggie when she won awards at school, Lily when she performed at dance recitals, Eleanor when she organized church events. Frank preferred the quiet role, the one where he could clap the loudest in the audience and let others take the stage. Still, there were moments when even Millbrook's slow pace reminded him of what he carried. The war memorial stood at the edge of town square, bronze names etched into stone. Frank knew too many of them. Sometimes, he'd walk past on his way to the hardware store, slowing for just a second, his eyes catching on a name before he moved on. No one noticed those pauses. No one noticed how his hands sometimes brushed his chest, where the old scars lay beneath the flannel. They just knew Frank as the man who built, who fixed, who stayed. And yet, the town that seemed frozen in time was changing in small ways. Teenagers hung out at the gas station, scrolling on their phones. A new chain store was rumored to be coming. People whispered about property developers sniffing around the edges of town. Frank didn't care much for any of that. He cared about the people, the way Mrs. Carver's hand shook a little more each year, the way the Jenkins sign paint was fading, the way Maggie seemed tired after long weeks at work, and the way Lily, restless and sharp-tongued, was growing up faster than anyone could catch. Millbrook was a town like a snapshot. Yes, but Frank knew snapshots could be deceiving. They captured smiles, not struggles. They showed buildings, not the quiet labor it took to keep them standing. And perhaps that was why he had always fit so well here. He was like the town itself, easy to overlook, but holding more history than people realized. That night, as he looked out the window of his study, the town square glowing faintly under the streetlights, Frank wondered if Lily would ever see Millbrook the way he did, not as a place stuck in time, but as a place layered with invisible work, invisible sacrifice. Maybe one day she would understand that families, like towns, don't endure by accident. Someone has to build them. Someone has to keep them from falling apart. And Frank had done that, quietly, all these years. Frank could still remember the first time he held Lily. It was a rainy spring morning, the hospital window fogged with condensation, the air sharp with antiseptic and coffee gone cold in paper cups. Maggie had been exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead, Eleanor crying quietly in the corner. And then the nurse had placed the tiny bundle in his arms. Lily's face had been scrunched tight, her fists no bigger than acorns, her cries sharp enough to pierce straight through him. Frank had whispered words no one else heard. "I've got you. You're safe now." He hadn't needed blood ties to feel the truth of it. She was his from that moment. From then on, Lily's presence had filled his world in ways he hadn't expected. She was a restless baby, often inconsolable in the dead of night. While Maggie tried to sleep and Eleanor rubbed tired circles on her temples, Frank would pace the length of the living room with her cradled against his chest. He hummed old hymns and country songs off-key, bouncing gently until her sobs softened into hiccups. And finally, sleep. Sometimes, when she refused to settle anywhere else, he'd sit in the recliner, her tiny body stretched across his chest, and stay awake until dawn just to keep her steady breathing close. As she grew, so did his devotion. At 3 years old, Lily had a streak of stubbornness that reminded Frank of Eleanor. She would cross her arms, stamp her foot, and declare no, with such conviction that Frank often had to turn his face away to hide a smile. He never raised his voice at her. He had seen enough shouting in his life to know it rarely built anything worth keeping. Instead, he had patience. When she refused to eat her vegetables, he built her a garden box in the backyard. Together, they planted carrots, beans, and tomatoes. Weeks later, when she pulled a carrot from the soil with her small muddy hands, she ate it raw and declared it the best she'd ever tasted. He went to every birthday party, every recital, every school event. Frank wasn't the loudest grandfather in the bleachers, but he was always there, steady as a post. He sat through hours of squeaky violin practice and applauded like it was Carnegie Hall. He carried her on his shoulders at the county fair until his back ached, just to let her see the parade floats over the crowd. He saved every crooked drawing she made for him, pinning them to the corkboard in his workshop. What he loved most about Lily, though, was her fire. She had a quick wit, a sharp tongue, and a curiosity that reminded him of himself when he was young. She asked questions he didn't always have answers for. Why was the sky blue? Why did bad things happen to good people? Why did he always wear long sleeves, even in the summer? He answered what he could, sidestepped what he couldn't, and smiled at the persistence in her eyes. But adolescence has a way of changing the light in a child. By the time she reached 14, Lily had become guarded, prickly, her words sharper than she meant them to be. The girl who once clung to his pant leg now pulled away, her phone a shield she rarely lowered. She laughed more with friends than with family, rolling her eyes at traditions that once thrilled her. Frank knew it wasn't unusual. He'd seen it with other teens, the way they stretched against the boundaries of love while secretly needing it more than ever. Still, the distance hurt. He tried to bridge it in small ways. He offered rides to school when Maggie was busy. He built her a bookshelf when she said she didn't have space for her growing collection of fantasy novels. He even sat down once to watch one of her television shows, though the flashing colors and quick dialogue left him dizzy. He didn't mind. It was her world, and he wanted to understand it, even if only from the edges. That was why the words at the dinner table had cut so deep. "You're not part of my real family." They weren't just careless. They felt like a tearing down of everything he had built with her since the day she was born. But even as the wound stung, Frank remembered the fire in her spirit. She was angry, yes, but anger was just passion looking for direction. He believed, deep down, that one day she would understand not just who he was, but what he had always been for her. For now, he sat in his study with the box unopened again, remembering the weight of her as a newborn against his chest. He let the memory settle over the sting of her words. She was his granddaughter, whether she knew it yet or not. Love, he thought, isn't erased in a sentence. It's written over years, in midnight lullabies, in dirty garden carrots, in clapping until your hands ache. And his love for her was written in ink too permanent for one sharp remark to erase. The wooden box had followed Frank through nearly every chapter of his life, though most people in Millbrook didn't even know it existed. He kept it on a shelf in his study, tucked just high enough that a casual glance would pass over it. To anyone else, it was ordinary, a scuffed oak container, the kind a carpenter might make in an idle afternoon. But for Frank, it held everything he had worked so hard to keep sealed away. He had built it himself the year he returned home from Vietnam. His hands had been restless then, always searching for work to keep his mind from circling back to the jungle. He spent a long night planing oak boards until they fit together perfectly, cutting dovetail joints so snug they looked like they had grown that way. When he stained the surface, he chose a deep chestnut that reminded him of the earth. After rain, the brass clasp, polished when it was new, had dulled over the years, but the wood remained sturdy. The box was strong, as he had needed to be. Inside lay fragments of a life most people in town never associated with quiet, steady Frank Mallory. There were medals he never displayed, tucked in velvet pouches that smelled faintly of mothballs, letters folded so many times they were fragile at the creases. Eleanor's handwriting curling across the pages, urging him to come home safe. Black and white photographs of men in uniform, their arms slung across each other's shoulders, smiling, despite the mud caked on their boots. Some of those men had never made it back. He kept their faces anyway, a silent promise that he wouldn't let time erase them. For decades, Frank rarely opened the box. He preferred to leave it closed, dust gathering lightly on the lid. He told himself it was because the past was heavy, but the truth was more complicated. He had wanted to build a new life, one defined not by war but by family, by sawdust on his clothes instead of blood, by laughter around the dinner table instead of cries in the dark. The box was a reminder of what he had endured, but also of what he had chosen to bury. And yet, after Lily's words at the dinner table, the box seemed to call to him again. He had carried his silence like armor, thinking it protected those he loved from the weight of his past. But maybe that silence had left space for misunderstanding. Maybe Lily didn't see him as part of her family because he had hidden too much of himself. She only saw the grandfather who fixed things, who sat quietly at gatherings, who never demanded attention. She didn't see the man who had carried wounded soldiers through fire, who had stitched skin with trembling hands, who had returned home, determined to build rather than destroy. That evening, Frank pulled the box down from the shelf and set it on his desk. He ran his fingers across the lid, tracing the grooves he had carved 50 years earlier. His reflection wavered faintly in the brass clasp, older now, lined with years. He hesitated before opening it, as if crossing a threshold. When he finally did, the hinges creaked softly, releasing a faint smell of paper and old wood. He lifted out the top item, a photograph of himself at 19, helmet tilted back, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His face was thin, eyes too old for his age. Behind him, the jungle blurred into shadow. He stared at the photo for a long moment, remembering the boy he had been, reckless and scared, doing his best to hold others together. That boy had never imagined he'd end up in a quiet town, raising a family that wasn't his by blood, but had become his by choice. Next, he unfolded one of Eleanor's letters. The ink had faded, but he could still read the words. "Come home safe. Maggie needs you. I need you." He remembered tucking that letter into his breast pocket each morning before patrol, pressing his hand against it like a shield. It had kept him grounded, a tether to a world beyond mud and fire. Frank laid the letter gently on the desk, then reached deeper into the box, pulling out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a silver star, the metal catching the faint light from the desk lamp. He held it in his palm, the weight both heavy and hollow. People had called him a hero once. He had never felt like one. The men who hadn't come home, those were the heroes. He had only done what needed to be done. Closing the box, Frank sat back in his chair, staring at it as though it had spoken. He realized then that keeping this part of himself hidden hadn't only been about protecting him. It had been about protecting Lily and Maggie too. But maybe, just maybe, the time had come for the box to open. Not just for him, but for them. If Lily was to understand who he truly was, she needed to see what lay inside. She needed to know that family isn't only built on blood, but also on sacrifice. On the choices a man makes when no one is looking. He placed the box back on the desk, this time not to hide it, but to leave it in plain sight. For years it had been closed. Now, it was waiting to be shared. Frank hadn't spoken much about Vietnam in all the years since he'd returned. Not to Eleanor, not to Maggie, and certainly not to Lily. The war lived inside him like a scar hidden under clothing, always there, but never displayed. He had learned early on that most people didn't want the details. They wanted a version of the story they could nod politely to, something clean and finished. "You served. Thank you. Welcome home." But Frank knew the truth wasn't clean. It wasn't finished. It clung to him in ways he couldn't explain without reopening wounds that had never truly healed. He had been 19 when he shipped out, barely old enough to shave properly, but already carrying the weight of a medic's kit strapped to his back. His mother had cried at the bus station. His father had shaken his hand too firmly, as though trying to press manhood into him in one final squeeze. Frank remembered the heat first, the thick, suffocating humidity that settled on his skin the moment he stepped off the plane. He remembered the noise too. Helicopters chopping overhead, boots pounding mud, the constant hum of insects that sounded like static lodged in his ears. He also remembered the faces, young men with eyes wide open, some hiding fear with bravado, others too quiet for their own good. They became his brothers, their lives bound together not by blood but by necessity. And as a medic, Frank had been the one they looked to when things broke: skin, bone, sometimes hope. He carried morphine, bandages, tourniquets. He carried hands that shook less than they should have. For his age, there were nights he woke even now to the sound of screaming that wasn't there. Nights when he swore he could smell the smoke and cordite. When he could hear the frantic cries of men calling for their mothers, as he tried desperately to keep them alive. He had held too many heads in his lap, pressing down on wounds he knew he couldn't close. He had whispered, "Lazul, be fine. You'll make it home," because hope was sometimes the only medicine he had left. And then there were the faces he couldn't forget. No matter how many years passed. Johnson, who used to draw cartoons on scrap paper during downtime. Morales, who carried a harmonica in his pocket and played it quietly under the stars. Davis, who wrote letters home every Sunday without fail. Some of them didn't make it past 19. Frank carried their names in silence. He never spoke them aloud at family dinners, never let them spill into conversations about work or weather. They belonged to him, locked inside the oak box, preserved in photographs that smelled of damp earth. When he came home, there had been parades for some, protests for others. Frank avoided both. He slipped quietly back into life, picking up a hammer and nails, building instead of breaking. He told himself he was finished with all of it. But the truth was, war doesn't finish with you. It lingers in the tilt of your shoulders, in the way you flinch at fireworks, in the silence you keep when people ask too many questions. Eleanor had known not to push. She never pried about what he had seen, though she saw the way he woke in the night. Chest heaving, sweat soaking the sheets. She would place a hand gently on his back until his breathing slowed. She never asked what the dream was. That was love. Frank always thought, the willingness to let someone keep their silence. But now, sitting in his study, the box open before him, Frank wondered if silence had gone too far. Lily didn't know this part of him, the boy who left, the medic who carried lives in his hands, the man who came home haunted but determined to build something new. She only knew the quiet grandfather who fixed fences, the man who seemed like an accessory at the family table rather than its foundation. Maybe if she saw this past, if she understood the weight he carried, she would know that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up, who keeps showing up, even when the world has broken them down. He traced his finger along the edge of the silver star, its metal cool against his skin. He remembered the night it was pinned to him. He had felt no pride, only exhaustion, thinking of the ones who should have received it instead. That memory had stayed locked away for half a century. But perhaps it was time to let it breathe again. Not for himself. For Lily. Frank closed the box carefully, his hands steady. He knew he couldn't keep the past buried forever. If he wanted Lily to see him as real family, she needed to see all of him, the carpenter, the father, the grandfather, but also the soldier who had once walked through fire and still chosen love over bitterness. The past was heavy, but maybe it was time to share the weight. Frank sat in the dim light of his study, long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. The clock ticked softly on the wall, each second stretching longer than the last. He kept his hand on the wooden box, the lid shut once again, but the memories stirred restlessly inside him, like something refusing to be buried any longer. Lily's words from the dinner table still rang in his ears. "You're not part of my real family." He had nodded, letting the words sink into him without protest, but the silence afterward had been deafening. Now, with the house wrapped in darkness, he felt the weight of a choice pressing against him. For so many years, Frank believed love didn't need credentials. You proved it in the day-to-day acts, not in speeches or grand gestures. Maggie had known him as dad because he showed up, because he never left, because his hand was always steady when she needed it most. He had hoped Lily would see him the same way, that the years of carrying her through sleepless nights, clapping at her recitals, building her bookshelves would be enough. But children see only the surface. They notice bloodlines, surnames, photographs, with missing faces. And in her frustration, Lily had spoken aloud what she saw. He realized then that perhaps his quiet way of loving wasn't enough anymore. The world had shifted. People no longer assumed the unseen. They demanded proof. Maybe Lily needed to see what he had kept hidden, not because he wanted to burden her, but because she deserved to know the whole of the man sitting at the end of her dinner table. Family wasn't just about love, it was about truth. And Frank had been keeping a part of his truth locked away in that oak box for half a century. The decision frightened him. Sharing his past meant reopening doors he had sealed with iron. It meant talking about nights soaked in blood, about the weight of bodies carried through mud, about the faces of boys who never made it home. He had never wanted to expose Maggie to that darkness, and certainly not Lily. He wanted their lives to be filled with lighter things, gardens, birthdays, the laughter that came from simpler struggles. But maybe, he thought, Lily's words had cracked something wider open. Maybe she doubted his place in her family, because he had never shown her the sacrifices that bound him to it. Frank leaned back in his chair, running his hand across his jaw. He thought about Maggie at 6 years old, calling him dad for the first time over a birdhouse. He thought about Lily as a baby, her tiny chest rising and falling against his as he rocked her to sleep. He thought about Eleanor, the woman who had never once asked him to dredge up the past, but who trusted him to carry it quietly. All of them were threads in the same fabric. And that fabric had been woven, in part, by the man in those photographs. Soldier, the medic, the boy who grew up too fast in the jungles of Vietnam. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, he would call Maggie. He would ask if Lily could spend a weekend with him. He wouldn't tell her why, not yet. He just needed time, with his granddaughter, away from the noise of the family table, away from the casual dismissals and the quick judgments. He needed a space where he could show her not with lectures, but with the truth of what was inside that box. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. The decision sat heavy, but it also brought a strange calm. For years he had avoided this reckoning, telling himself silence was safer. But silence had built a wall between him and the girl he loved most. Now, it was time to break it down, brick by brick, with stories, with memories, with the kind of truth that could not be argued away. When he opened his eyes again, the house was still quiet. Eleanor's breathing was faint upstairs, steady in the way of a woman who trusted her husband's silences. The town outside was dark, streetlights glowing like patient sentinels. Frank reached out and set the box squarely in the center of his desk. Tomorrow, it would not return to the shelf. Tomorrow, it would begin to speak. He whispered into the empty room, not to anyone in particular, but to the memory of Maggie as a child, to the newborn Lily he once promised to protect, to the faces of men he had carried through fire. "It's time," he said softly. "It's finally time." For the first time in years, Frank felt a shift, not just the weight of the past pressing on him, but the possibility of passing it on, not as a burden, but as a legacy. Tomorrow, he would begin. Frank never liked talking on the phone. He was from a generation that preferred showing up at someone's door, hat in hand, voice steady, eyes meeting eyes. Phones always felt like flimsy substitutes for real connection, too much room for static, for silence that couldn't be softened with a look. But that morning, after a night spent staring at the wooden box on his desk, Frank knew he had no choice. The first step in what he meant to do was a call to Maggie. He poured his coffee as the house stirred awake. Eleanor hummed in the kitchen, her slippers shuffling against the tile. She asked if he wanted toast, and he said yes, though his mind was elsewhere. He sat at the table, the steaming mug in his hands, the phone waiting beside him like a test he had to pass. He turned the phone over, back and forth, tracing the scratches on its case, buying time. Finally, with a sigh, he pressed Maggie's number. She answered quickly, her voice tired but alert in that way working mothers often sounded. "Hi, Dad. Everything okay?" That word, Dad, hit him in the chest every time. Even now, decades after she first said it, he swallowed before answering. "Yeah, sweetheart. Everything's fine. I was wondering." He paused, listening to the faint background noise of dishes clinking, a radio playing softly in her kitchen. "I was wondering if Lily could spend the weekend with me. Just her." There was a beat of silence. He could almost see Maggie frowning on the other end, her free hand on her hip the way she always stood when something caught her off guard. "Just Lily?" she asked slowly. "Is something wrong?" Frank shook his head, though she couldn't see it. "Nothing wrong. I think it's time she and I spent some real time together, away from all the noise." He tried to keep his tone even casual, but he suspected Maggie heard the weight beneath it. She hesitated. He could hear her draw in a breath, could almost imagine her glancing toward Lily's empty chair at the breakfast table. "She's been difficult lately," Maggie admitted. "Teenage stuff. Snappy, moody. I don't know what gets into her sometimes." Frank smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "She's finding her way. We all did at that age." Another pause. "Dad, she said something last night that hurt you, didn't she?" Maggie's voice was softer now, probing. Frank closed his eyes, his thumb brushing the handle of his mug. He could lie, brush it off, but the truth was simpler. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She did, but it's not her fault. She doesn't know the whole of me yet. I think it's time she did." On the other end, Maggie exhaled. "You've always kept so much inside. I used to wonder if I'd ever really know all of you. And now you want to tell Lily." "I don't want to burden her," Frank replied. "I just want her to understand. To see that family is more than blood. She's old enough now." Maggie was silent for a long moment. He let her take her time. Finally, she said, "All right. I'll bring her by Friday after school. But, Dad," her voice cracked just a little, "don't scare her. She's still my little girl." Frank's throat tightened. "I know, sweetheart. I promise. I'll just tell her the truth, gentle as I can." When the call ended, Frank set the phone down and stared at the sunlight creeping through the blinds. The decision was no longer just in his head, it was in motion now, carried on the current of Maggie's trust. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on him, heavy but familiar, like the rucksack he once carried through the jungle. He had chosen this. He had asked for it. And now, he had to see it through. Eleanor walked in with his toast, setting it beside him. She noticed the look on his face and raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, Frank?" He took a sip of coffee before answering. "Lily's coming to stay this weekend." Eleanor smiled faintly, though her eyes searched his. "And you're finally going to open that box, aren't you?" Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at the wooden box sitting on the desk in the next room, sunlight glinting off the brass clasp. At last, he nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think it's time she knows who I really am." Friday evening arrived with the low rumble of a school bus on the street and the faint chatter of kids spilling into the neighborhood. Frank stood by the window, curtain drawn just enough for him to see Maggie's car pull into the driveway. His heart gave a small, steady thump. He had been calm all week, or at least he told himself he had. But now that the moment was here, nerves settled into his chest like stones. The wooden box sat in plain view on the coffee table, a silent presence in the living room. He hadn't opened it again since Monday, but its weight seemed heavier every day. That Maggie stepped out of the car first, waving quickly before walking around to open the passenger door. Lily emerged slowly, shoulders hunched, backpack slung low. Her earbuds were in, wires tangled across her jacket. Her expression distant in that practiced teenage way that said, "I'm here, but don't expect me to be happy about it." She barely glanced at Frank, standing on the porch. "Thanks for taking her, Dad," Maggie said, kissing him on the cheek as she handed over Lily's duffel. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Frank replied, his voice steady, though his hand tightened. Briefly on the strap of the bag, Maggie gave Lily a pointed look. "Be good. Listen to Grandpa." "Yeah, Mom," Lily muttered, eyes fixed on the ground. When Maggie's car pulled away, the silence between them stretched thin. Frank cleared his throat, gesturing toward the door. "Come on in, kiddo. Dinner's ready." Inside, the house smelled faintly of roasted chicken and rosemary. Eleanor had set the table before leaving for her sisters for the weekend, giving Frank space. The plates gleamed under the soft kitchen light, and the old clock ticked above the doorway. Lily dropped her bag near the couch and slid into a chair without removing her earbuds. Frank served her a plate anyway. He didn't mention the earbuds. He didn't press. He had learned long ago that forcing someone to listen usually made them turn away. Instead, he poured her a glass of milk, set it beside her plate, and sat across from her. For a while, the only sound was the scrape of forks against ceramic, and the faint buzz of music leaking from her ears. After a few minutes, Lily tugged out one earbud. "This is good," she said grudgingly. Broad Frank gave a small smile. "Your grandma's recipe. She says rosemary fixes just about anything." Lily smirked faintly, the kind of expression that was there and gone in an instant. She took another bite, then noticed the wooden box on the coffee table in the next room. Her brow furrowed. "What's that?" Frank followed her gaze. For a moment, he thought about brushing it off, telling her it was nothing. But he shook his head. "Not tonight. Not after everything. That's something I've been meaning to show you," he said carefully. "But not yet. We'll get there." She looked at him skeptically. "Is it like old man stuff? Tools or something?" Frank chuckled softly. "Something like that." They finished the meal in quiet, the silence less sharp now, softened by the warmth of food. After dinner, Frank offered cocoa. Lily hesitated, then nodded. He stirred the milk and powder on the stove, the smell of chocolate filling the kitchen. When he handed her the steaming mug, her fingers wrapped around it, and for a brief moment she looked younger, the hardness slipping away. They moved to the living room. Frank lowered himself into his recliner, while Lily curled up on the couch, mug in hand, scrolling half-heartedly through her phone. The wooden box sat between them, patient, waiting. Frank didn't touch it. Tonight wasn't about rushing. Tonight was about presence. He cleared his throat. "How's school?" She shrugged. "Fine. Still drawing?" he asked. Her eyes flicked up a little. Frank nodded. "You've got a gift, kiddo. You see things different than most people. That's worth hanging on to." For the first time all evening, she met his gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but she didn't look away. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock, the faint clink of her spoon against the mug. Later, when she went upstairs to the guest room, Frank lingered in the living room. He reached for the box, resting his palm on the lid. Not yet, he thought, but soon. Tonight had been about breaking the ice, reminding her that he wasn't going anywhere, even if she thought he didn't belong. Tomorrow, the box would open. Tomorrow, the past would speak. As the house settled into silence, Frank allowed himself a small, weary smile. The first night was over. The bridge had begun to form, plank by plank, across the gap her words had carved. The next morning dawned, slow and gray, the kind of overcast light that softened the edges of everything. Frank was already downstairs, moving quietly through the kitchen. He cracked eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the silence, and set bread into the toaster. He wasn't sure if Lily would eat much, but breakfast was his way of saying, "You belong here." By the time she shuffled down the stairs, still in her sweatshirt and pajama pants, the table was set with scrambled eggs, toast, and a jar of jam. "Morning, kiddo," he said, keeping his tone light. She yawned, rubbing her eyes, and dropped into the chair. "Smells good." They ate in companionable silence. Lily scrolled idly on her phone between bites, but Frank didn't mind. He had learned long ago that presence mattered more than conversation. After breakfast, she wandered into the living room while Frank rinsed dishes at the sink. When he returned, she was standing by the coffee table, staring at the wooden box. Her phone lay abandoned on the couch. Her fingers hovered above the lid, not touching, but close enough that Frank could see the curiosity sparking in her eyes. When she realized he was watching, she pulled her hand back, a little defensive. "Sorry, I didn't mean to snoop." Frank wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked over slowly. "It's all right. You're not snooping. You're noticing. That box is meant to be noticed." Lily tilted her head. "What's in it?" He lowered himself into the recliner with a careful sigh, gesturing for her to sit. She settled on the couch, pulling her knees up, her gaze locked on him. For a moment, he considered brushing it off again, telling her it was just keepsakes. But her question hung in the air with more weight than he expected. "Pictures," he said finally. "Letters. Some medals. Pieces of a life I haven't talked much about." Her brow furrowed. "Like, from when you were younger?" Frank nodded. "From before I was anyone's father. From Vietnam." She blinked, surprised. "You were in Vietnam?" The question hit him like a gust of wind. He realized then that Maggie must never have told her. He couldn't blame her, he had been the one to keep it quiet. Still, hearing the shock in Lily's voice made him understand just how invisible that part of him had become. "Yes," he said softly. "I was a medic. Spent a few years over there. It's not something I've shared much. Not because I'm ashamed, but because, well, because some things are heavy to carry. And I didn't want to weigh down people I love." Lily leaned forward, her chin resting on her knees. Her expression softened, curiosity overtaking her practiced teenage indifference. "So that's why you kept the box?" "That's why," Frank said. He paused, then added, "But lately, I've been thinking maybe I kept it closed too long. Maybe I should have opened it sooner." She glanced at the box again, then back at him. Can I see?" The question was small, tentative, but it pierced through him. He saw something in her eyes: hesitation, yes, but also the beginning of connection. She wanted to know. For the first time, since her sharp words, at the dinner table, she was reaching across the gap. Frank nodded slowly. "Not all at once. Some of it's hard, but I can show you." He leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "Before we open it though, I want you to understand something." Lily tilted her head, waiting. "I didn't choose this family because of blood," Frank said, his voice steady. "I chose it because it was the most important choice I ever made. When your mom was little, I promised her I'd never leave. And when you were born, I promised the same to you. That box doesn't change that. It just shows you the road I walked before I got here." For a long moment, Lily said nothing. Then she nodded, her expression caught between confusion and awe. "Okay," she whispered. "Show me." Frank reached for the box, his fingers brushing the cool brass clasp. His chest tightened, but not with fear this time, with a strange, steady relief. The question had been asked. The door was open. Frank eased the wooden box onto his lap, the weight of it more symbolic than physical. He ran his thumb over the brass clasp before flicking it open. The hinges creaked softly as the lid lifted, releasing the faint smell of old paper and dust, a scent like forgotten libraries. Lily leaned forward, her eyes wide, phone forgotten on the couch cushion beside her. For once, she wasn't half listening, she was all in. The first thing he pulled out was a photograph. its edges frayed, the black and white image faded from years of handling. In it, a group of young men stood in the jungle, uniforms muddied, helmets tilted. Some grinned at the camera, others just stared, eyes sunken but alive. Frank pointed to the one in the middle, a boy with a jaw too sharp and shoulders too narrow for the weight he carried. "That was me," he said quietly. Lily blinked. "You look so young." "I was 19. Barely old enough to know how to be a man, but old enough to be dropped into a war." He let the words hang there, letting her absorb them. "Then," he added, "these men here, they were my brothers. We didn't have the luxury of blood ties. We had the bond of survival. That bond is different. It never leaves you." He set the photo gently on the table and reached for a folded letter. The paper crackled as he opened it. Eleanor's handwriting curled across the page, smudged in spots where his damp hands had once gripped it too tightly. "Your grandma wrote me this. I carried it in my breast pocket every day." He handed it to Lily. She held it carefully, reading the first line aloud. "Come home safe. Maggie needs you. I need you." Her voice wavered. "Did it work?" she asked softly. Frank chuckled without humor. "In a way, yes. That letter reminded me there was something worth coming back to. Some days, it was the only thing that kept me moving." Next, he pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside gleamed a silver star. He placed it in Lily's hands. It looked too heavy for her palms, the way it had always felt too heavy for him. "They gave me this for dragging 3 men out under fire," he explained. "Truth is, I don't remember much except the sound of gunfire and the weight of boat. I don't wear it. I don't display it. Because the real heroes are the ones whose names are etched on that wall in town. They never made it back." Lily looked at the medal. Her lips parted. "You never told Mom about this." Frank shook his head. "I told her enough. But I didn't want her childhood filled with ghosts. I wanted her to know me as Dad, not as the man who carried too many dead friends on his shoulders." He leaned back, taking a breath. "War leaves marks you can't see. You learn to carry them quietly. But the mistake I made was thinking silence was the same as strength." His eyes softened as he looked at her. "Silence kept you from seeing who I really was." Lily's fingers traced the edges of the medal. Her voice was small, hesitant. "Why are you telling me now?" Frank rested his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "Because last week, you told me I wasn't part of your real family. And I nodded, because I knew you believed it. But here's the truth, Lily. Family isn't just who shares your blood. It's who shows up, who stays, who carries your burdens even when they're too heavy. I've carried mine quietly for a long time. Maybe it's time I let you carry some of the story with me." For a long while, Lily didn't speak. She just looked at him, her eyes shining in a way that made her look younger, vulnerable. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Frank said gently. "But now you do. And that makes you part of it. My story is yours too." The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock. Between them, the box sat open, its contents spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle. And for the first time, Frank felt the wall between him and his granddaughter begin to crack. Replaced not with pity, but with understanding. Lily turned a silver star over in her hands, as if it might reveal something new on the back. Something that explained the weight it carried. The metal gleamed faintly under the lamplight, the 5-pointed star catching every flicker of brightness, though the ribbon attached to it was faded from years tucked away. She looked up at Frank, her brows drawn. "So, you got this for saving people." Frank exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "That's what the paperwork says. Gallantry under fire. Sounds cleaner than it was." He rubbed his thumb across the arm of his recliner, his mind slipping back into that humid night half a century ago. "We were pinned down outside Da Nang, fire coming in from the tree line. It was chaos smoke, shouting, men dropping into the mud. I remember thinking there was no way we'd get out. Then I heard someone yell for a medic. Not just once. Over and over, like a bell ringing." He paused, his eyes distant, then met Lily's again. There were 3 of them. Johnson, Morales, and Davis. Good boys. Barely older than you are now. They were bleeding bad. I crawled through the mud, bullets snapping overhead. I don't remember being brave. I just remember thinking if I didn't move, they'd die. So I dragged them back, one at a time. Carried one on my shoulders, pulled another by his vest, pressed my hands against wounds I couldn't close. By the time we reached the chopper, I was soaked in blood that wasn't mine. I thought for sure that was it for me." Lily's grip on the metal tightened. "Did they make it?" Frank's voice softened. Two of them did. One didn't. Johnson, he was 19. He'd been drawing cartoons the night before, showing us how he could make a horse look like our sergeant. He didn't wake up on that chopper. I think about him more than I think about this medal. He gestured toward the star in her hand. They pinned that on me later. Called me a hero. But Lily, heroes aren't the ones who come home with medals. They're the ones who don't come home at all. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the tick of the old clock. Lily stared at the medal, her throat working as she swallowed. She had never seen her grandfather like this. Never heard him speak in a voice so raw, stripped of the quiet humor he usually carried. It unsettled her, but it also drew her closer. "You never told Mum this?" she asked, finally. Frank shook. His head. I didn't want her childhood filled with death. I wanted her to grow up with birthdays and Christmas mornings, not ghosts sitting at the table. So I kept it quiet. Locked it in that box. Lily set the medal down gently on the table, her fingers lingering on it. "And now you're telling me?" "Because you asked," Frank said simply. "And because you're old enough to understand that silence doesn't mean absence. I was always here. I chose this family, every day, because it gave me something to fight for after the fighting was done. You, your mum, your grandma, you're the reason I built a life worth coming home to." Her eyes shimmered, and she quickly blinked them clear. She looked away, embarrassed by the emotion tugging at her. Frank didn't press. He leaned forward, closing the medal back into its pouch. "This star doesn't make me real, family, Lily. What makes me real is sitting at that table, clapping at your recitals, rocking you when you were colicky, teaching your mom how to sand a birdhouse. Medals tarnish. Choices don't." Lily finally lifted her gaze, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "I think I get it now." Frank gave a small, tired smile. "You don't have to get it all at once. Just know this. You've always been my real family, whether you saw it or not." The medal sat between them on the table, a silent witness, not just to the war he had fought abroad, but to the war he had quietly fought at home, proving, without words, that love was his truest act of courage. Frank reached back into the box, his hand moving past folded letters and pouches until his fingers brushed against the thin edge of another photograph. He drew it out slowly, almost reverently, as if the paper itself might crumble in his hands if he rushed. Unlike the black and white war pictures, this one was in color, faded but still alive with warmth. He handed it across to Lily. She took it carefully, her brow furrowing as she studied the image. It was her mother, Maggie, maybe 6 years old, wearing a white dress with a crooked bow in her hair. She was smiling, gap-toothed, perched on Frank's lap. He wasn't in uniform. No medals, no helmets, no mud. Just a plaid shirt, jeans, and a look on his face Lily had never seen in real life: unguarded joy. The kind of smile that comes from something deeper than a joke or a passing moment. "That was the day your grandma and I got married," Frank said softly. "Your mom was nervous, didn't know what it meant for her. She'd already lost one father. I think she was afraid I'd disappeared too." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We took that photo right outside the church. She'd been holding my hand so tight during the ceremony, I thought she might cut off my circulation. Afterward, when the photographer asked us to sit, she climbed right onto my lap without asking, like she was making a decision of her own. That was the first day she called me Dad." Lily's eyes lingered on the picture. "You kept this all these years?" Frank nodded. "Longer than the medal, longer than most things. Because that was the moment I stopped being just me. I became someone's father, not by blood, by choice. And that choice has meant more to me than anything else. I've done." He reached out, tapped the edge of the photo with one rough finger. "That smile on her face, that's worth more than ribbons or stars. That was the real honor I carried home with me." Asterisk. Lily glanced up at him, her expression softer now, the sharpness gone from her features. "Mom's never shown me this. She probably doesn't even remember it was taken," Frank said with a small chuckle. "Kids don't notice the moments when their lives change. But I do. I remember every detail. The way her shoes scuffed the floor as she ran out of the church. The way she tugged at my sleeve when we posed, like she was making sure I wouldn't let go. That photo, it's proof of a promise I made, that I wasn't going anywhere. That she could call me Dad and I'd earn it every day after." For a moment, Lily was quiet. She turned the photo over, as if expecting to find something written on the back. There was nothing, just blank paper, yellowed with age. "Why didn't you ever frame it?" she asked. Frank smiled faintly. "Because it wasn't for display. It was, for me, a reminder. Some things you don't put on walls for others to see. You carry them close. Let them guide you. Lily looked back at the image, her lips pressing together. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, "You really have been here the whole time, haven't you?" "Every step," Frank said. "Even when you didn't notice. Even when you thought I was just the quiet one at the end of the table. That photo is proof. I didn't have to be your mom's father, but I chose to be. And when you were born, I chose you too. That's the thing about family, Lily. Sometimes it's given, sometimes it's built. Either way, the love's just as real." She looked down at the photo again, and this time she smiled a small, shy curve of her lips that reminded Frank of Maggie at that same age. She handed it back, her fingers brushing his for just a moment longer than necessary. "You should frame it," she whispered. Frank studied her face, saw the crack in her defenses widening, letting light through. He tucked the photo gently back into the box, but in his mind, it was already framed in the only place that mattered, his heart. Lily sat back on the couch, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes darting between the open box and her grandfather's weathered face. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him like background furniture at family dinners. She was really seeing him, the boy in the jungle, the man with the medal, the father in the photo. The weight of it all pressed on her chest until she felt like she couldn't breathe. Frank leaned into the recliner, his hands folded loosely in his lap, giving her space. He didn't push. He'd spent a lifetime learning that silence could be a gift, that the hardest truths surfaced not when demanded but when allowed. So he waited, his gaze steady, his breathing calm. Lily's fingers tightened around the fabric of her sweatshirt. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking through the quiet. Frank tilted his head. "Tell you what, kiddo? That you did all this, that you saved people, that you were there, that you were—" She trailed off, her throat tightening. "That you weren't just some old guy who fixes things around town." A sad smile tugged at Frank's mouth. "Because I didn't think you needed that story. I thought what you needed was a grandpa who showed up for school plays, who built your bookshelves, who made you cocoa. I thought love was enough without credentials." Her eyes shimmered, and she looked away quickly, swiping at them with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "But it wasn't. Not for me. I said those awful words because I didn't know. I thought you were just quiet, like you weren't really part of us." Frank leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "And now," Lily's voice cracked, "now I feel stupid. I feel awful. You've been here this whole time, and I didn't see it. I didn't even try to see it. I just..." Her words caught, and a tear slipped down her cheek. She ducked her head, embarrassed. Frank reached out, slowly, carefully, the way you'd reach for a skittish animal. He rested his hand gently on her knee. "You're 14, Lily. 14-year-olds don't see everything. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to test the world, push at it, see where it bends. Sometimes that means saying things you don't mean. I know that. I was young once too." She shook her head, tears sliding freely now. "But I hurt you. I saw it. You didn't yell, but I saw it in your face, and I can't take it back." Frank's voice was soft, but firm. "You don't need to take it back. You just need to grow from it. That's what family does. We get hurt, we forgive, and we keep walking together." Her shoulders trembled. "I don't deserve you after what I said." He squeezed her knee gently. "Lily, listen to me. Family isn't about deserving. It's about staying. You could scream at me, push me away, doubt me 100 times, and I'd still be here. That's the difference between blood and choice. Blood makes you related. Choice makes you family." Her eyes lifted to his, red-rimmed and wet. "I'm sorry, Grandpa." 2 words, but they landed heavier than anything she'd said before. Frank gave her a small smile. "Apology accepted. And for what it's worth, you'll probably say something sharp again someday. That's life. But now you'll know what's behind this quiet old man at the end of the table." Lily let out a shaky laugh, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "You're not just an old man. You're more than I thought." "Good," Frank said, leaning back. "Because you're more than you think to. That fire in you, that's a gift. One day it'll make you strong. Just remember to aim it at the right things." She nodded, sniffled, then slid across the couch until she was next to him. For the first time in years, she leaned against his shoulder, her weight small but real. Frank sat still, letting her settle, his heart tightening in the best kind of ache. The wall between them had cracked. Now, piece by piece, it was falling. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear. The kind of early autumn day when the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, and leaves crunched underfoot. Frank dressed the way he always did for church, pressed slacks, a clean button-down shirt, shoes polished until they gleamed. He tied his tie slowly in the bathroom mirror, his fingers steady from years of repetition. Downstairs, Lily sat at the kitchen table, her hair brushed back neatly, though she still tugged at the sleeves of her sweater, as if uncertain. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," Frank said gently as he poured his coffee. "No one will hold it against you." She glanced up, almost offended. "No, I want to. I want to see what it's like." Frank gave a single nod, hiding the warmth that rose in his chest. He'd never once pressured her to join him at Sunday service, knowing teenagers often found excuses. But now, after their long talk and her tears the night before, she seemed curious, perhaps even eager. The little white church stood at the end of Main Street, its steeple sharp against the morning sky. The bell rang out, clear as Frank and Lily walked up the steps together. People turned when they entered, not in judgment, but in recognition. Nearly everyone in Millbrook knew Frank. He was part of the church's backbone. He had fixed the pews when they wobbled, repainted the nursery walls when they peeled, and built the wooden cross that hung above the pulpit. As he walked down the aisle, men tipped their hats, women nodded, children whispered, "That's Mr. Mallory." Lily noticed it all, her eyes darting from face to face. She had never really thought of her grandfather as someone other people looked up to. At home, he was just quiet Frank, sitting in his recliner. But here, among the congregation, she saw the subtle respect in the way people greeted him, not flashy, not loud, but real. They settled into a pew near the front. The service began with hymns, the organ filling the room with sound that seemed to press against the stained glass windows. Lily didn't sing at first, just listened, sneaking glances at her grandfather. His voice was low, gravelly, but sure. He sang every verse, his eyes fixed on the hymnal, though he clearly knew most of the words by heart. When the pastor stepped up to speak, he glanced briefly at Frank. "Today," he said, his voice carrying through the sanctuary, "I want to talk about service. Not the kind you put on a resume, but the quiet service that builds a community without asking for thanks. Folks, we are blessed with examples right here among us." Lily's stomach tightened when she saw the pastor gesture toward Frank. "This man has never sought attention," the pastor continued, "but he's kept the very walls of this church standing. He's fixed benches, repaired leaks, built shelves for the children's Sunday school. And beyond these walls, he's been there for neighbors in ways most of us never even hear about. That's service. That's love in action." Applause rippled through the congregation, soft but sincere. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his cheeks coloring. He nodded once in acknowledgement, then lowered his head, clearly eager for the moment to pass. Lily stared at him, stunned. She had never heard anyone speak about him like that. After the service, people filed out to the steps where coffee and donuts were laid out. Mrs. Carver from the bakery patted Frank on the arm, thanking him again for fixing her door. Mr. Jenkins, the barber, clapped him on the back and said, "Couldn't do without you, Frank." A young mother with a toddler stopped to tell him how much she appreciated the shelves he'd built for the nursery. Each person treated him with a quiet reverence, as though he was a cornerstone of their lives. Lily walked beside him, listening, watching. For the first time, she felt the weight of what her words at the dinner table had missed. He wasn't just part of her family, he was part of everyone's family. The town itself leaned on him, trusted him, respected him not for medals or titles, but for being steady, dependable, and kind. As they walked home, she slipped her hand into his, unprompted. Frank glanced down, surprised, but said nothing. He simply gave her hand a small squeeze, the corners of his mouth lifting in a quiet smile. For Lily, the Sunday service had been more than hymns and sermons. It had been a revelation. The man she had dismissed as background was, in fact, the foundation. Monday morning, Lily slumped into her desk at Millbrook Middle School, already dreading the week ahead. History class usually felt like a chore, dates to memorize, battles to recite, names of people long gone. But that day, Mrs. Hawthorne wheeled in a cart stacked with folders and stood at the front of the room with a kind of bright energy that made the students groan even before she spoke. "All right, everyone," she said, clapping her hands. "It's time for our annual family history project. Each of you will research a story from your own family ancestor, a parent, a grandparent, and present it to the class in 2 weeks. We're not looking for famous names, but for the stories that make your family yours." A collective sigh swept through the classroom. One boy muttered, "Can't we just Google someone famous?" The class chuckled, But Mrs. Hawthorne shook her head firmly. No, this isn't about strangers in textbooks. It's about recognizing the history living under your own roof. You might be surprised what you find. Lily sat straighter in her chair, her mind already racing. Normally, she would have dreaded this assignment, convinced her family's stories were too ordinary to be interesting. But now, after the weekend with her grandfather, after the medal, the photograph, the Sunday service, she knew exactly whose story she needed to tell. When the bell rang, she walked out into the hallway with her best friend, Chloe, who was already rolling her eyes. My mom said I have to interview my granddaughter about quilting. Quilting? How boring is that? Lily hesitated before answering, her voice low but certain. I think I'm going to do mine on my grandpa. Chloe blinked. Frank, the guy who fixes swings at the park. Yeah, Lily said, and for the first time, she didn't bristle at the dismissive tone. She just smiled faintly. There's more to him than people think. That afternoon, when she came home, she found Frank in the garage, sanding down a piece of oak. The smell of sawdust hung in the air, golden light streaming through the small window. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. For a while, she didn't say anything, just listened to the rhythm of sandpaper against wood. Finally, she cleared her throat. Grandpa, he looked up, his eyes softening at the sight of her. Hey kiddo, how was school? Good, she said, stepping into the garage. We got this project in history class. We have to tell a story from our family's past, and I want to tell yours. Frank froze, the sandpaper stilling in his hands. He studied her face carefully, searching for hesitation, but found only resolve. He set the wood down gently on the workbench. My story, he asked quietly. She nodded. About Vietnam, about the medal, about Mom calling you Dad that day in the photo, about everything you showed me this weekend. I think people should know. Frank's chest tightened. For years, he had carried those memories like a burden too heavy to share. Now his granddaughter wanted to lift them up. Not as weight, but as truth. Are you sure, Lily? Some of it's hard. I'm sure, she said firmly. Mrs. Hawthorne said, the point is, to find a story that makes our family ours. And that's you. You're the story. He exhaled slowly, emotion flickering in his eyes. If you want to tell it, I'll help you. But remember, medals and battles aren't the whole truth. What matters is what came after. The family we built. The life we chose. Lily smiled. That's the part I want to tell the most. Over the next week, evenings in Frank's living room turned into history lessons of a different kind. He pulled out photographs, letters, even maps he hadn't touched in decades. Lily scribbled notes in her school binder, her pen racing to capture every detail. She asked questions that made him pause, questions he never thought to answer out loud. Were you scared? Did you ever think you wouldn't come home? What kept you going? Each answer seemed to close the gap between them a little more. By the time Friday came around again, the box no longer felt like a vault of secrets. It felt like a bridge, one they were crossing together, and for Frank, watching Lily lean over the table with her pen scratching furiously, her eyes alive with curiosity, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just remembered, but understood. The classroom buzzed with the restless energy of middle schoolers about to present in front of their peers. Some clutched hastily stapled reports. Others shuffled poster boards covered with photos copied from the internet. The air smelled faintly of pencil shavings, dry erase markers, and nerves. Lily sat near the middle, her binder open in her lap, her heart beating a little too fast. Normally, she dreaded these kinds of projects. She hated standing up front with 30 pairs of eyes staring at her, waiting for her voice to crack or her hands to shake. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just presenting homework. She was carrying her grandfather's story. Mrs. Hawthorne tapped the edge of her desk. All right, who's next? A boy named Tyler finished a rambling story about his uncle's fishing trips, holding up a photo of a catfish nearly as big as him. The class clapped politely. Then Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze landed on Lily. How about you, Miss Mallory? Lily's throat tightened. She rose slowly, smoothing the front of her sweater, and carried her binder to the front of the room. She stood there for a moment, staring at her classmates, some bored, some curious, some whispering to each other. She swallowed, then opened her binder. My project, she began, her voice small but steady, is about my grandfather. Most of you probably know him as the quiet guy who fixes things around town. But what you don't know is, there's more to him than that. The room grew stiller. A few kids leaned forward. He grew up here in Millbrook, but when he was 19, He went to Vietnam. Not as a soldier with a gun, but as a medic. That meant when people were hurt, when they thought they weren't going to make it, he was the one who ran out there and tried to save them. She paused, glancing down at her notes, then back up. One night, when his unit was pinned down, 3 men were shot. My grandfather crawled through gunfire to get to them. He carried them to safety one at a time. 2 of them lived because of him. 1 of them didn't. And for that night, they gave him a silver star. A murmur ran through the room. The kids weren't laughing or fidgeting now. They were listening. But here's the thing, Lily continued, her voice gaining strength. He doesn't even keep the medal out where anyone can see it. He keeps it in a box. Because to him, the real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. He never bragged about it. He didn't even tell my mom. Not really. He just came back, and he built a life. She held up a photograph Frank had let her copy, the one of him with Maggie on his lap outside the church. This is my mom, the day she first called him dad. He's not her dad by blood, but he chose to be. He chose to raise her, to stay, to show up every single day. And when I was born, he chose me too. I didn't understand that at first. I even told him once, he wasn't part of my real family. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. But I was wrong. He's more real than anything. Because family isn't just blood. It's who carries you, who shows up, who never lets go even when you try to push them away. Asterisk silence stretched for a moment. Then Mrs. Hawthorne began to clap. One by one, the rest of the class followed, the sound filling the room, louder than Lily expected. Some of her classmates nodded with genuine respect. Even Tyler, who usually joked about everything, whispered, "That's pretty awesome." When she returned to her seat, Chloe leaned over. "Wow, I didn't know your grandpa was like that." Lily smiled faintly, still flushed. "Neither did I, but now I do." Back at home later that afternoon, she found Frank in the backyard, trimming the rose bushes. She dropped her backpack on the porch and walked over. Without saying a word, she slipped her arms around him in a hug. Frank froze for a second, pruning shears still in his hand. Then he set them down and wrapped his arms around her gently. "So," he murmured, "how'd the project go?" Lily pulled back, her eyes shining. "They clapped. They listened. They know who you are now." Frank smiled softly, his throat thick. "That's good, kiddo. But the only one who needed to know was you." Friday night dinners at Maggie's house had always been noisy, clattering, conversations overlapping, the smell of garlic bread and sauce filling every corner. That evening was no different. The table was set with steaming bowls of spaghetti, salad tossed in a wooden bowl, and glasses of sweet tea that sweated in the warm kitchen air. But for Lily, the meal felt different before it even began. She had something heavy on her chest, something she had been waiting all week to say. Frank sat in his usual spot, at the far end, calm and quiet, listening as Maggie rattled on about a long day at work. Eleanor filled in details about a church fundraiser, while the younger cousins argued about who got the bigger meatball. Lily twirled pasta around her fork without eating, her gaze flicking between her grandfather and her mother. She could still hear the applause from her presentation echoing in her ears. She could still feel the warmth of her classmates' eyes, as they saw Frank for the first time the way she now did. She didn't want her mother and grandmother to miss that. Halfway through the meal, she set her fork down. Her voice trembled at first. "I need to say something." The table quieted. Maggie looked at her daughter, eyebrows raised. "What's on your mind, honey?" Lily's gaze shifted to Frank. He gave her a small nod, encouraging, his eyes steady. She drew in a breath. "Last week, I said something awful to Grandpa. I told him he wasn't part of my real family." Her voice cracked, and I was wrong. I was so wrong. The room fell into a stunned silence. Maggie's mouth parted. Eleanor froze with her fork halfway to her lips, and the cousins glanced nervously at one another. Frank didn't move, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm but watchful. Lily pushed forward, words tumbling faster now. "I didn't know who he really was. I thought he was just quiet, just there, but he's so much more. He was in Vietnam. He saved people. He got a silver star. And when Mum was little, he chose to be her dad. He chose this family, every day. And when I was born, he chose me too. That's real. That's more real than blood." Maggie's eyes widened, filling with tears. "He told you about Vietnam?" Lily nodded, her voice softening. "He showed me the box, the photos, the medal, everything." She turned to Frank, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "And I'm sorry. I needed you to know that. You're not just part of my family. You're the reason it feels like family at all." The words lingered in the air, fragile but powerful. Eleanor set down her fork and reached for Frank's hand, across the table, squeezing it tightly. Maggie leaned back in her chair, shaking her head slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered, "all these years, I never knew the details. You carried it all by yourself." Frank cleared his throat, his voice low. "I carried what I needed to. I didn't want your lives shattered by mine. But maybe I should have trusted you with more. Especially you, Maggie. Especially you, Lily." Maggie reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "You didn't have to earn being my dad. You always were. And you don't have to prove it now. But thank you for finally letting us in." The cousins, sensing the gravity of the moment, sat quietly. Even they seemed to understand that something important was unfolding. Lily leaned sideways, pressing her head against Frank's arm. He glanced down at her, then rested his weathered hand gently over hers. Dinner resumed eventually, though the tone was different. The clatter and chatter softened into something warmer, steadier, the kind of atmosphere that came not just from food but from truth laid bare. Maggie kept glancing at her father, her expression a mix of sorrow and pride. Eleanor's smile was faint but radiant, her thumb stroking Frank's hand, as if anchoring him. For Frank, it felt like a circle closing. The truth had finally reached the table, not in whispers or fragments, but in the voice of his granddaughter. And though he had never sought recognition, hearing her words had mended something inside him that had been quietly fractured for years. As the plates emptied and the evening wound down, Maggie raised her glass of tea. "To Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling but strong. "The man who chose us." Everyone lifted their glasses. Frank didn't make a speech, he simply nodded, his eyes shining, and took a sip. Beside him, Lily whispered, "I love you, Grandpa." This time, Frank didn't just nod. He whispered back, "I love you too, kiddo, always." The house had grown quiet after dinner, the cousins taken home, the dishes stacked in the sink, the laughter lingering like smoke after a fire. Frank sat alone in his recliner, the wooden box still on the coffee table in front of him. The lamp cast a soft circle of light, illuminating the medals, the letters, the photographs that had once been hidden away. Now they were out, touched by new hands, spoken into new ears. For the first time in decades, the past didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a gift. Lily padded down the stairs in her socks, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She hesitated in the doorway, then stepped into the room. "Can't sleep," she muttered, her voice small. Frank smiled faintly. "Happens to the best of us. Come on, sit." She curled up on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter. For a moment they sat in silence, the clock ticking steadily on the mantel. Then Lily looked at the box again. "You're really okay with me telling your story? For school, I mean. For people to know?" Frank leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Kiddo, my story isn't mine anymore. Once I chose this family, everything I carried became part of you too. If you tell it, you're not just talking about me, you're talking about us. About how love holds a family together." Her eyes glistened in the lamplight. "I don't think I'll ever forget this weekend." "Good," Frank said softly. "Because someday, someone's going to say something sharp to you, something that makes you doubt your worth. And I want you to remember, family isn't decided in a sentence. It's proven in a lifetime." She nodded, tucking her chin against the blanket. "You always know the right thing to say," he chuckled. "Not always, but I've had practice. Years of it. The truth is, I didn't think I'd be good at this. I didn't think I deserved to be anyone's father or grandfather. But then your mom climbed on my lap that day, and later you were put in my arms in the hospital. And suddenly it wasn't about deserving, it was about showing up." Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm glad you did." They sat there for a long time, the night stretching around them like a blanket. Frank thought of the men whose faces stared back at him from old photographs, the ones who hadn't come home. He thought of how easily his story could have ended in a jungle half a world away. Yet here he was, an old man in a quiet town, holding the trust of a granddaughter who once believed he didn't belong. He reached into the box one last time and pulled out a small card, yellowed with age. On it, written in his younger handwriting, were words he had once scrawled to steady himself during the worst nights overseas. "Honor isn't what you earn, it's what you protect." He handed the card to Lily. "Asterisk this," he said, "is the only legacy I want you to carry. Not the medal, not the scars. Just this. Protecting honor yours, your families, the people you love, that's the job. That's what makes a life worth living. Lily held the card delicately, as if it were made of glass. She read the line twice, her lips moving silently. Then she looked up at him, her voice firm. I'll remember, I promise. Frank leaned back, his heart full. For years, he had worried that the story would die with him, that the silence would swallow it whole. But now, it lived in Lillian. Her words, in her school project, in the promise shining in her eyes. Good, he said with a quiet smile. Because when I'm gone, it's not the box that'll matter. It's you. You're the line that carries it forward. She crossed the room and hugged him, her blanket slipping to the floor. He held her close, breathing in the moment, knowing it was more permanent than paper or medals. Legacy wasn't a thing locked in oak and brass. Legacy was alive, warm, and sitting right there in his arms.